Thank you for joining. Today we'll discuss SPRS scoring, POA&Ms, and the False Claims Act. By way of a quick introduction, I'm Jay, the Director of GRC Services at Elevate Consult. I have over 2 decades of cybersecurity experience, and I'm also a lead CCA. Let's get started. Let me start with 3 numbers. $6.8 billion. That's what the Department of Justice recovered under the False Claims Act in 2025 alone. Over 1,200 new whistleblower lawsuits were filed in the last 12 months, roughly 100 per month, and whistleblowers can collect up to 30% of what the government recovers. Those numbers are not abstractions. They represent a very active enforcement environment, one that directly affects defense contractors. 3 cases that have already happened. Georgia Tech settled for $875,000 after failing to implement antivirus tools and maintain a system security plan. Penn State paid $1.25 million for misrepresenting their NIST 800-171 implementation dates and submitting inaccurate SPRS scores. HealthNet Federal Services paid $11.2 million for falsely certifying compliance with cybersecurity requirements. Every one of these cases involved an organization that submitted a compliance representation to the federal government that didn't reflect their actual security posture. That's what this mini-class is about, understanding your SPRS score, what a POA&M actually is, and what the legal standard means for the person in your organization who signs off on these representations. The Supplier Performance Risk System, or SPRS, is the federal database where defense contractors enter their self-assessed NIST SP 800-171 compliance score as a condition of contract award. The score is based on 110 security requirements from NIST SP 800-171 Revision 2. Perfect score is 110. Unimplemented controls reduce the score. The score is self-attest, meaning the organization enters it without independent verification at the time of submission. Here's what makes the consequential. The score is not private. It is visible to the DoD and used in contract award decisions. CMMC assessors validate the score during assessment, and when the score differs significantly from the self-attest score, that discrepancy is the red flag that can trigger a False Claims Act investigation. The SPRS score is a legal representation to the federal government. The affirming official, the person who signs off on it, is personally signing a contract with the U.S. government on that claim, not the company, the person. I want to spend a moment on the legal standard, because this is the part most organizations misunderstand. To bring a False Claims Act case, the government does not need to prove the contractor intended to defraud. The standard is knew or should have known. If the affirming official submitted an SPRS score without actually verifying that controls were fully implemented and effective, the government can argue they should have known the score was inaccurate. And here's why this setup is already in place. The government has the self-attest SPRS score on record from the time of contract award. They have the CMMC assessment results. When those 2 numbers differ significantly, the documentation of potential fraud is already assembled. The contractor created it by submitting an inaccurate self-attestation. The standard is not did you lie. The standard is did you know or should you have known that your score was inaccurate. That is a much lower bar. And affirming officials who enter a score without rigorous validation of their actual control implementation are operating at meaningful legal risk. Let me clarify the difference here between a POA&M and an operational plan of action, because these are frequently confused, and using the wrong one creates compliance problems. A plan of action and milestones, or POA&M, is a formal document identifying tasks that need to be completed, the resources required, the milestones, and the scheduled completion dates. Under CMMC, POA&M items must be mitigated within 180 days. And here's the critical restriction most organizations don't know. Not all controls are eligible for a POA&M. Only a select group of controls can have open POA&M items and still result in a conditional certification. All other controls must be fully implemented and met. And to even qualify for good status, the organization must cover at least 88. An operational plan of action is different. It addresses temporary vulnerabilities and temporary deficiencies, situations where a known fix exists but hasn't been implemented yet. It does not have a defined remediation timeline. This is for situations like a validated cryptography patch that hasn't been released yet. The fix is coming, the vulnerability is known, and temporary, and it goes in an operational plan of action. These two documents are not interchangeable. Using a POA&M for a control that is not POA&M eligible is a compliance error. Using an operational plan of action when a POA&M is required misses the 180-day remediation obligation. Assessors catch both errors. The system security plan is not just a compliance artifact, it is a legal document, and I want to explain specifically what that means and why that matters. The SSP is what the assessor uses to understand your environment and determines what examinations, interviews, and tests will be required. If the SSP doesn't match the actual environment, or if the systems are missing, if data flows are inaccurate, if control descriptions don't reflect how controls are actually implemented, that discrepancy is a finding. It's also a signal that the self-attestation may not have been accurate. Something many organizations don't realize. The SSP itself may qualify it as controlled unclassified information, specifically as controlled technical information. It may contain IP addresses, system configurations, architecture diagrams. It must be handled, stored, and shared with the same controls you apply to CUI. If you're storing your SSP in a cloud GRC tool, that tool must be moderate authorized, now certified. If it's not, you may have a CUI handling issue in the very document that's supposed to document your CUI handling. The SSP must be current. If it was written once and hasn't been updated since your last infrastructure change, your last cloud migration, or your last service provider change, it does not accurately reflect your environment. And an inaccurate SSP is a problem for both your assessment outcome and your attestation accuracy. The Customer Responsibility Matrix, sometimes called a Shared Responsibility Matrix, is a document your external service providers should provide that defines which CMMC controls they are responsible for and which ones fall to you. Here's why assessors look at this carefully. They compare your SSP against the CRM, and controls your ESP or CSP is responsible for must be accurately documented in your SSP. And any controls that are your responsibility must be documented as implemented by you. Gaps between what the CRM says and what the SSP shows are red flags. The most common failure I see, the organization says their MSP handles patch management. CRM shows patch management is the organization's responsibility. The SSP doesn't document how patch management is actually implemented. That's a gap, and it's a finding. I also want to flag something that happened in 2025 that every organization relying on an MSP or an enclave provider should know about. A prominent managed service provider that operated a CMMC compliant enclave product abruptly ceased operations, apparently shutting down without notifying clients. Organizations that had built their CMMC compliance infrastructure on that enclave woke up one day to find it was gone. The lesson? You are accountable for every control in your scope, whether you implement it directly or rely on a third party to implement it. My MSP handles that is not a complete answer without a documented CRM, and it's not a defensible answer without verified compliance on the provider's end. Let me cover two more items that come up frequently in assessments and that most organizations underuse or misuse. Enduring exceptions. An enduring exception is a special circumstance where full CMMC compliance is generally not feasible for a specific asset. An OT system required to replicate a field configuration, a medical device, test equipment, IoT systems, or government-furnished equipment. Assets with documented enduring exceptions are only assessed against one CMMC practice, that's CA.3.12.4, instead of all 110. That's a significant scope reduction for complex environments. But, and this matters, the enduring exception must be documented in the SSP, and the asset must be properly categorized. This is not a mechanism for excluding inconvenient systems from your scope. It is a legitimate accommodation for assets where full remediation generally isn't technically feasible. Assessors know the difference. And I'll say this directly. Proper asset categorization at the start of your process, which I covered in Mini Class 01, is what makes an enduring exception defensible. If you haven't categorized your assets correctly, you can't document enduring exceptions correctly. Temporary deficiencies are different. A temporary deficiency is a condition where the fix is known and feasible, but hasn't been implemented yet, often because it's vendor dependent. Again, a FIPS validated cryptography patch that's required but hasn't received final validation from the vendor yet. The fix is coming. The deficiency is temporary. That goes on an operational plan of action, not a POA&M, because there's no internal remediation deadline. The timeline is determined by when the vendor releases the validated version. Here's the one thing you can do this week. Ask your affirming official one question. On what basis did you enter your current SPRS score? What documentation, what validation process, and what expert review supported that number? If they can answer that question confidently with specifics, the assessment methodology they used, the controls they verified, the expert guidance they relied on, your score may be defensible. If they hesitate, reference a self-assessment done in an afternoon without expert guidance, or generally aren't sure, you have work to do. 3 follow-up actions here. First, pull your current SPRS score from SPRS.app and document when it was last updated and by whom. Second, compare that score against your actual control and implementation status today. Has anything changed? Have controls regressed? Has your environment changed without a score update? Third, if there's a meaningful gap between your submitted score and your actual posture, consult with a qualified CMMC professional before your next contract renewal or award. The gap is fixable. False Claims Act investigation is significantly harder to fix. The question is not whether your SPRS score is perfect. The question is whether it is defensible. 4 things to take from today. 1. The SPRS score is a legal representation to the federal government. The affirming official, the person who signs off on it, is personally accountable for its accuracy. 2. The False Claims Act standard is knew or should have known, not intent to defraud. Submitting an inaccurate score without proper validation creates meaningful legal exposure, regardless of intent. 3. POA&Ms and operational plans of action are different. Documents with different requirements. Using the wrong one for a given situation or applying a POA&M to a control that isn't POA&M eligible is a compliance error that assessors will catch. 4. Enduring exceptions are a legitimate scope reduction tool, but only when properly documented and only for assets where full compliance is generally not technically feasible. They are not a mechanism for excluding inconvenient systems. If you want to go deeper, the full webinar covers everything in much more detail, including the real-world examples of how assessors evaluate evidence, what the customer responsibility matrix looks like in practice, and how to prepare your team for assessor interviews, all from a lead CA with direct assessment experience. Link is in the description. Is your score defensible? See you there.